there's always reasons to be afraid. Everything you do is a risk, and everything you don't do is a risk, and so you get to pick your risks. And I knew at the time that I made the videos that for me the risk of not speaking out was far greater than the risk of speaking out, because I could see, I think, can see what's happening. I could see it coming, I can see it coming, and it's reflected in the intense polarization, increasing polarization in our societies. And there's massive geological entities moving underneath the surface. You know, they're like ice flows, and we're standing on top of them, and that's dangerous. And the way through it is to think and to speak and to communicate, so that we can negotiate our way through this mess without having to resort to violence, because violence is the alternative to free speech. That's it. Violence or submission is the alternative to free speech. So that's not a good alternative, not at all. In
your speech that you did today regarding free speech and censorship on campuses, you spoke about postmodernist thought, and a lot of that thought is also echoed in your YouTube videos as you talk about Solzhenitsyn and Nietzsche and their predictions of the 20th century and what happened. Could you just define postmodernist thought and social constructionist thought as well for people who don't understand it?
The postmodernist thought is predicated on the idea that the ideals of modernism, so those in some sense would be Enlightenment ideals, the ideas of rational discourse and objectivity and say scientific inquiry and the free exchange of ideas and the marketplace of ideas, and even the idea of, say, liberal education itself, which is a core value of the universities, that's all to be dispensed with, because there are no overarching truths. That's the postmodernist stance. There are no overarching truths. Everything is up for grabs. Now, of course, that's an internally contradictory philosophy, because it leads you with no direction for action. But the postmodernists deal with that by allowing their philosophy to be nested inside of a Marxist doctrine. And so all the postmodernists, the French postmodernists, were Marxists to begin with. And so when their postmodernism provides them with no direction, because it can't, they just revert to the idea that it's oppressor against oppressed. And they define that by whatever categorical structure is handy at the time, right? I mean, it can be race, it can be ethnicity, it can be language, it can be gender, it can be sex. And the problem with that is that it can be any indefinite number of other things as well. So the oppressor versus oppressed narrative is one that isn't questioned by postmodernists, because they're basically Marxists as well, even though that really can't exist as an overarching narrative from the postmodern perspective. But it was a system of ideas developed by French intellectuals in the 1970s, especially Jacques Derrida. Michel Foucault is another one, Jacques Lacan. There's a handful of them, and it's founded on an important observation, which is that it's difficult to dissociate the observer from the observed, which is to say that when you approach any situation, whatever it happens to be, you're going to bring a set of inbuilt biases to bear on it. And that colors your interpretation. And because that's the case, your interpretation of something will be different than someone else's and different than someone else's. It's not easy to come up with a canonical interpretation. So the question would be, well, what is this book about? Well, there's a very large number of answers to that question. And so the postmodernists have hijacked that observation to say that, well, there's no real stability in viewpoint or value. And also that value systems in and of themselves are oppressive and always pit the oppressor against the victim, and so should be dispensed with. Well, that's the fundamental claim of postmodernism. Value systems should be dispensed with because they cause oppressor and oppressed. But the problem with that is that without a value system, you have nothing to live for. There's no value in anything. It eliminates your responsibility if you don't have a value system, so that's a plus. But without up and down, there's no movement up. There's no motive force forward. There's nothing positive to push back against the suffering that's intrinsic in life. And of course, the postmodernists also don't take into account the fact that value hierarchies or power structures, for that matter, can be predicated on competence, not just oppression, competence and ability, and skill and talent and beauty and all sorts of things that seem to be intrinsically worthwhile. And also that there's a multiplicity of value structures within a complicated society like ours. So even if you are oppressed by one standard, which is almost certainly to be the case, you know, because you're too ugly, or you're too fat, or you're too stupid, or you're, you know, or your skin color disadvantages you, or you're estranged sexually, or like there's an indefinite number of ways that you don't measure up, and that society is somehow set against you with a critical eye. But then there's a very large number of games you could play, and just because you're a loser in one of them, or two of them, or 10, doesn't mean you have to be a loser in all. And the postmodernists don't take that into account. They consider the value structure, that's the patriarchy, and it's universally oppressive, and all the victimized people are the same. It's like, no, they're not. It's wrong. It's foolish. It's unidimensional. It's low resolution. It's pseudo-intellectual. And it's absolutely, it dominates the universities, because you can learn it in about a week. You sound like an intellectual to outsiders, and you don't have to do any work, any real thinking. Perfect solution.